Okie doke. Hi everyone. I just thought a few people have asked me to expand a little bit on one of the videos I did a little while ago about how to use Dorico a little bit, especially if you're someone who knows how to do lots of musical stuff, such as you're a Finale user or even a Sibelius user and you're wanting to move over. Just a bit of a how to get started and kind of get your fingers into it. I tend to find the best way is by doing, so let's just get into it. So let me just open up Dorico here. This should work with any version of Dorico. You'll just generally be limited by the number of players and how much customizability rather you have in options to how your music looks. So first of all, we open up the Steinberg Hub, which you get when you click Dorico. And this is what you're presented with when you want to start a new score. So obviously you'll have your recently open scores in there when you've got some. You can open or import a file down here. In the Learn tab, there's some videos and tutorials and a copy of the manual and things like that. A little bit about what's new in the newest version, whatever version you have installed, and then create new. So if you are starting from scratch, this is probably where you want to be. I'm going to come at this from the point of kind of classical orchestral music, but obviously all of this stuff applies to whatever kind of music you're going to write. Just not going to get into any esoteric kind of techniques that modern music has, because I'm not super familiar with them, but I think that in things like that, when you've got a need for it, it's better to go and find it then. Just get started with the basics. So there's a few templates you've got here that you can start with. Right, so there's all the kind of typical things, bands, chamber, choral stuff. Empty is always good to start with. Jazz, orchestral, you won't have these two probably. Sketches and solo. These two are Scoring Express, and it's by a company called Notation Central. They make some templates. I've got the chamber and theatre templates installed. I think they're fantastic. They've got all these engraving options and things set for you. I highly recommend them. So go and check them out. That said, like I would always take a clean, careful eye over everything and check them all at the end. Okay, so if I go into orchestral, right, and I want a classical orchestra, right, I could just double click that, and then start to put in some info over here. So I can put in the title, the composer, etc. Right. However, I'm going to start from empty. And I'm going to put nothing in just so I can show you where everything is. I'm going to not set anything at all. Yeah. My suggestion is you set a bit of stuff here while you can, but I just kind of want to show you what a clean slate project looks like. Okay, so this is what the setup tab looks like in Dorico. In Dorico, the way the program thinks is very, very structured and segmented, right? And that's quite important. Not so much important for you to understand how it works behind the hood, but it's important for you to know that when you are working in the program, you need to work structured and segmented like that too. So in the setup tab is where we set up our score. We set up who's playing, what the scores and parts are going to look like in terms of what players are on part, what information's there, if you've got multiple movements, that kind of stuff all gets set up here. Then we move to the right tab, right? And in here, we're going to, it won't look like this once we've actually got some players. We're actually going to write music, right? And it's impossible to change setup things in write mode. In write music, all you're doing is writing stuff. So when you make a change in write mode, such as to move a hairpin or a tempo marking or a writ or a change a note value, it changes the actual music, right? So no matter what you want your music to look like or sound like, if you want a half note, you put in a half note. Exactly like that, right? So even though you might, if you're talking about playback with VSTs, you might want something that looks like more like a dotted half note, a dotted minim, because you want it to hang on a little bit longer. Maybe because the VST you're using doesn't have very good sustain. You can do that later. You can do that in play mode, right? In write mode, what the music actually is, right? That goes in here. Then you move on to engrave mode. Again, it will look a little bit different in this middle zone once we've got some stuff. Engrave mode is where you do the engraving, which is the process of laying everything out. So all the stuff you have in write mode will be here in engrave mode, and you tweak it. So you go, okay, this needs to be a little bit higher, a little bit lower. You move things around a little bit. Importantly, though, nothing you do in engrave mode changes the music. So you can't make a minim into a crotchet here. Likewise, you can move a tempo marking on the page, but it only moves it on the page, right? It's not actually moving where it is in the music. So if you move it in engrave mode to look like it's a bar earlier, play mode will ignore that. Playback will play it back where it originally was, and it will still look where it originally was in every other part, right? Then you have play mode. Obviously, I've spoken about some stuff already. This is where you set up your VSTs and you can make tweaks to the length of different notes and add reverb and all those kinds of things. Then you have print mode where you print, and obviously I've got nothing at the moment to print on. Print also means print to PDF, right? Okay, so to switch between these modes, you can click up here, or I find it much, much more useful, as I suspect everyone will, for most things, to use the keyboard. So the keyboard shortcuts for this are Command if you're on Mac, Control if you're on Windows. I'm going to give commands all in Mac because I've got a Mac, but they're reasonably easy to translate. Command on Mac is Control on Windows. Option on Mac is Alt on Windows. And you very rarely use Control for anything on Mac. So Command 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cycles through these tabs here. So if I want to go to write mode, I can go Command 2. If you're looking for what I'm currently pressing, it's down in this bottom right hand corner, and I'll move it if I need to, right? So that's Command 2, but let's go back to setup mode, Command 1. Okay, so what are we going to do first? I'm actually thinking for this tutorial / series, we're going to put in a little bit of a Beethoven symphony, right? Okay, so I want a basic standard orchestra, right? Okay, so I've got a few things I could do. You can see here, you can actually click here, but once you've got some stuff here, you won't be able to click in the center. So these same things to add players are down here, right? So I could add a single player, add a section player, add an ensemble, and then do some grouping and sorting stuff, right? So sorting is ideal for if you've dragged things out of place or you want something particularly different. Groupings is if you have things like choirs and there's two of them and you want to group some things together for some reason. But generally standard kind of orchestra stuff we're going to leave alone. Okay, I'm actually going to work this backwards. Add ensemble. What does that do? You click add ensemble and you can build an ensemble or choose one, right? Now, I don't personally use it very often. If you go to choose ensemble, you'll see some standard kind of ensembles. So in an orchestra, you're probably going to have double woodwinds, so 2 flutes, 2 oboes. You know, you get the idea, right? You're probably going to have something like a 4-2-3-0 brass section, right? Or maybe if you're doing big cinematic scoring, you might have this, which is 8 horns. You can add multiple people at once this way. Strings, string section, or with no bass, or it might just be violin, viola, cello, etc. Singers, you can add a choir. Build is just a quick way to do the same thing, right? Except you can customize it yourself. So if you would like, let's say you would like one of each brass instrument, you could go horn, trumpet, trombone, I forget what the acronym is. I don't use this very often. Tuba, and you know what? I want double bass as well. CB, contrabass. And you could hit enter or add. You can save it if you use this regularly. You can see where the power in this comes from. If you know what you want, you can get it in pretty quickly. I think choose is probably the more useful tab here, but often I will start with a template that already has most of the things I want. I'm just adding 1 or 2. So I'm not going to go here. So instead, I've got section and solo players, and the ensemble we add will consist of section and solo players. It's just a way of adding them really quickly. So what's the difference? Well, it's kind of as it says on the packet, right? A single player is one person in your orchestra, right? So in your orchestra, when you have a flute part, one person plays that flute part, right? Whereas if you have a violin part, a full section of violins, a group of people play the same instrument, right? And play the one part, right? So, for example, flute in orchestra is a single player generally. You'll have 2 single players, or 3 depending on your scoring, obviously. In very classical orchestra, you'd have 2 single players. However, in a concert band, you would have a section of flute ones, right? Because you tend to have multiple people playing the flute one part, right? So, just to give you a bit of an idea, I'm going to add a bit of orchestra. So I'm going to add a single player, and I'm going to add a flute. So I hit add single player down here, and then I can just start typing flute. And you can see I'm already there, and I can just hit enter. And I've got a flute. Yay, great. Now just ignore that little note performer pop-up for now. Okay, what happens if I want 2 flutes? Well, I can add another single player and I can type flute again. Actually, this time I'm going to find it the hard way. I'm going to go woodwinds, find flute. Where are we? Flute. And I'm going to go add. There we go, I've got my 2 flutes. I'm going to do 2 oboes now. This time I'm going to use, I'll type oboe. And you can see that there are some options for different kinds of oboes. So if I don't have the oboe I want, right, I just need to clarify a bit. If I want bass oboe, right, etc. Anyway, 2 oboes. I'll add them in. Okay, now let's do some instruments that have transpositions. Let's go to clarinet. Okay, so you can see that different kinds of transpositions of the same instrument type are actually in a subcategory, right? So we found clarinet that we want, right? And it picks the standard transposition, B flat. So you can just hit enter, right? If you want a clarinet in E flat, you just change down there and hit add, right? And you can see that it automatically put it above the B flat. That's because at the moment I've got my order set to orchestral, right? So it's automatically sorting. I can move them manually and it will override it, but for now we don't want that. To delete a player, you can either right click or hit this delete player, or you can change the instrument it's holding, right? And the way you do that, right, is like this. You open this drop down, and this drop down shows you the instrument that the person is holding. So I can rename each person something different to the instrument they're holding. So for example, I might, if I was doing a musical theatre score, I could call this person read 1 and hit this plus here and also give them a clarinet. And this means that they can switch between flute and clarinet. Now you can only do this for single players because a section of violins can't switch to a section of clarinets, right? If you need to do that, you'll have to use single players, unfortunately. Okay, so let's just undo this. So I'm just going to use Command Z to undo those 2 things. So if I want to change this E flat clarinet to B flat clarinet, I can hit this ... next to the instrument and go change instrument and go to clarinet again and hit change. Okay, now my sorting's gone out of whack, so I'm just going to drag to fix that. Okay, so far so good. If I quickly put this score into transpose pitch down the bottom here, it is also in the edit menu up here, but I'm going to go transpose pitched. Right. You can see at the moment I've got nothing, but if I just go into right mode for a second and change this to C major, you can see that now the transpositions are correctly applied. Right. Okay. Let's continue. So we add more and more players. I'm going to leave that for a second. I'm going to add some section players, right, so you can see the difference. Add a section player. Now, the section players, for the most part, are going to be strings. So my classical orchestra has got a violin section. Violin, add. Section of violin 2s. Now, it knows, right, automatically, when you add multiple, it will add a number. So you got a flute 1 and a flute 2, and it knows that for violins the convention is to call them by Roman numerals. And you can see that we're starting to get a score build up here. We've got a viola section, cello, and a bass section, right? So you can see one of the pitfalls of this though is that it has chosen singers for bass, right? A bass singer. If I go down here, this is brass bass, right? So you do need to be just a little bit careful. You'll, after spending a bit of time with the program, you'll remember which ones are the tricky ones. And of course you only do this once. I will just manually select it. For string instruments, as opposed to transpositions, they have different tuning systems that you might want to select from. So this is a standard double bass in E, A, D, G tuning, right? With a C below if you have a 5th string. But there are some solo tunings where we move all of the strings up a tone. But I just want standard, so let's go ahead. Right? Okay. That is most of the things I want to talk about with the players in setup mode. So we've set up our score how we want it. I will finish setting this up off camera for the next video, but this will do for now. Okay, so what else is going on here? You'll have noticed that every player over here, right, has got a corresponding layout over here with this little music stand symbol next to it, right? That's a part, right? So you can see, right, if I click on the flute 1 part, you can see it's attached to the flute 1 player, right? If you click on the flute 2 part, flute 2 player, etc., etc. Now, why is this useful or relevant, right? Why am I bringing this up? Well, if I click on the full score, which you can see has got a slightly different symbol, which mainly is to do with layout options, but we'll get to that later, you can see that everyone is in the full score, as you'd expect, right? So if you can make changes to who's in what parts, completely up to what you like, right? So for example, say I'm working on a something that has voice in it. Maybe it's a theatre score, maybe it's an opera. I might choose to add a solo player. I might add a piano, right, and call this rehearsal piano, right? And obviously I would like to have a rehearsal piano part, but my full score, I don't want it to have rehearsal piano in it. So I can hit full score, and then I can untick rehearsal piano, and it no longer appears there. But just because it no longer appears there doesn't mean it's not affected, right, by writing music. So when you add bars or delete tempo markings, it will still be linked, right? So my recommendation, right, if you are going to have a full score that is missing things, would be to have one part that still has everyone in it, right? So if I just turn this back on for a minute, actually I'm just going to delete this play. No. You can do the same in reverse, right? So I've got a part with a rehearsal pianist, say it's accompaniment with oboe solo, I can add the oboe into that part. And if I just bring up that part for a second, you can see it's automatically renamed it, but you can rename it to what you like. I've got this, right? It's got the oboe there and the piano, right? Cool. Okay, let's just delete that rehearsal piano player. When you go to delete a player, that's what this little bin's for. It will warn you and say if you're going to delete a player, any music you've written on that player will also be deleted. So be careful. You can choose to delete the player, or you can delete the player and any parts where that player is used. So I want to do that because I don't need this part here anymore, right? Now, they've disappeared from that part, but that part is still spare because it had someone else in it. So I'll just delete that manually. Okay, so what do you want to do when you want more layouts, either parts or scores? There is an add full score button here, and add part layout button here, right? You can click on them and add whatever you like. Right. There's a custom score layout. I have yet to find a use for that, but I'm sure there is one. There's a button to sort them to make sure they're in the same order as the score order. And then you've got some settings which you can get to in other much quicker ways. And same thing here, right? Okay, so you can see any number of players can be in any number of layouts just by ticking the box, right? Pick a layout and tick the boxes you want, or vice versa. Pick a player and tick the layouts you want them in. Okay. But for something like a classical score, a full score and then a part per person is good. Part per instrument. Okay. We got one kind of big tab down the center. Now this is the flows tab. Now flows is an idea that you may or may not be familiar with from other programs. Basically, you can think of flows like movements, right? They are separate pieces of music, right? Generally, you're going to stop and start between each of them. You might not stop and start through an attacca movement or a segue or something like that, depending on your field. But they have their own heading generally and can be done on their own when you play them, something like that, right? There are millions of uses for flows, but that's what they're intended for, right? So for a movement symphony work, like a multi-movement work like a symphony, which is what I'm going to be looking at, flows is really useful for movements, right? So at the moment I have one default flow, right? If I'm just writing a piece or a song, that's great. However, I want multiple flows. So I just hit this add flow button and I get a new flow. And you can see I'm immediately ready to call it something. I'm just going to call it 2 because that's kind of standard in the orchestra world, right? And I'll double click on the title of this one and call it 1. And a symphony typically has 4 flows, so I'll add them in. And like with most things, you can right click a flow and there will be things like duplicate and delete and whatnot. There is some notation option settings. Again, there's quicker ways to get to those things here, but this is the important one. This is how you delete a flow, right, if you don't need it. Now, you can see when I click a flow, I get all these checkboxes in the players list and the layouts list. And that's because just like players and layouts, any flow can be in any layout or assigned to as many players as you like. So, for example, I'm going to add an E-flat clarinet player. I shouldn't have deleted the one I had before, right? But that E-flat clarinet is only going to be in movement number 2, right? So I can click on the E-flat clarinet player and say, you don't play in flow number 1 and you don't play in flow numbers 3 or 4. And so it's gone from number 1, but it exists in 2, and then gone from 3 and 4. But you can see that if I click on the layout, that the E-flat clarinet part still has 1, 2, 3, and 4 ticked. What that means is that if I go and look at the E-flat part, when it's printed, they will get some tacit notifications. It looks a bit weird. There's no headings because we didn't set that up correctly. We'll do that in a minute. Right. So this is really useful to tell a player that, hey, you're not needed in this movement, but something is still going on, so you should pay attention, right? Because you'll be needed later, or etc. Okay. So just as you can take some flows off of a player, you could also take some flows out of a layout, right? So let's delete our E-flat clarinet weirdness. And we get our full score back. Now say that maybe you've finished your work, right? And you've printed out this thing and then you realize maybe this is for a concert you're doing. And then all of a sudden you realize that one of the songs that you were going to do, you're not going to do anymore, right? Maybe you've decided you're not going to do the second movement, right? It's usually the slow movement. I don't like slow movements. Let's get rid of it. So without deleting the music, I can just say full score, don't include the second movement. And it's gone. I know you wouldn't have noticed a change here, but there's only 3 here now, right? But it still appears in the parts. So I could select all of these parts by click and then shift clicking and then take the second movement. And if I go and check the flute 1 part, there's now only 3 movements. And if I go and put it back in, the fourth movement comes back, right? Okay. This is pretty much everything that you can see in setup mode, right? That you can't see anywhere else, right? So then I want to talk about a couple of options things that you probably want to do in setup mode because it's when you're thinking about it, right? And I say that primarily because they're things you generally want to do before you start, just to get a bit of an idea of how your music's going to look, but also because it's a little bit easier to work with when you can see your music looking the way you expect it to. Okay, so first of all, before I move on, all of these commands for things that we've done in here, right, you can usually find in the setup drop-down menu in the top here. Each mode, setup, write, engrave, play, and print, all have their own one that switches out, right? So when you go into write mode, if I hit Command 2, this changes to write, right? So most of the things you want to do are in here, right? Okay. The library, though. Now, the library is like the library is the big library of settings that Dorico uses, right? So in here are all the fonts, all the paragraph styles, the page sizes, the different note heads, all the lines and things. And probably the most important ones are these here, the options, right? This is where you're going to go when you want to customize how your music looks, or plays back in this case. And then the library manager, right? So just quickly, let's go through these options and explain what they are, because some of them are a little bit, they feel like they overlap. So just as we spoke about how Dorico's broken up into these pieces, right? These different modes, the options are split up into similar kind of modes, right? So as you can imagine, engraving options is meant for when you're engraving, right? It is changing the way that things look, very, very individual things. So if I click on it to show you, right, you can change, right, which, how accidentals stack, you know, whether you want them stacking on top of each other like this, whether they're allowed to stack over the top of ledger lines, or whether they are not allowed to. Or let's find one I know a bit better. Dynamics, right? When you have subito, do you want sub or do you want subito? Do you want it on the left or the right of the forte? When you have, let's find another example, hairpins, do you want dotted or dashed? When you have poco crescendo and you're using a hairpin instead of the text, do you want the poco above or below the start, or do you want it inside the center, right? And even things much, much more detailed than that, such as what is the minimum distance to the right of this bar line that the dynamic should cross, right? Or how close to the end of the system is a dynamic allowed to get? And there's, I want to say millions, I'm sure it isn't, but millions of settings here, right? Because the way that Dorico works, and this is very, very important, right, is that when you don't like the way something looks, there's probably a setting for it that you want to change. So you want to build your default settings to be exactly what you want, and then fix one or two little tweaks on each page, right? Rather than moving everything around by hand, right? So it's very different from Sibelius and Finale in the sense that, yes, it's a what you see is what you get editor. However, you want to change as much of it as you can in the settings and leave the tweaks to things you actually need to override. Okay, so let's close out of these. Sorry, I can't see the close button. Go back to library. The next one is layout options. Now this is probably the one you want to do first, right? If you go in here, you can see each layout and you can change its options, right? So for example, my full score, I probably want that on A3 paper, but I'm happy for the size to be down at 6mm or raster size 5, right? you can change lots and lots of other settings. I might save it for another day to go through them all here, but this is where you change what the paper looks like, right? Not what the music on top of it does, right? So, as an example, so I've changed it to A3, right? And if I hit apply and then move this out the way, you can see that has now applied. The staves are smaller. Some other kind of key ones though that I want to get to quickly, right, are these. So if I go down in this page setup, each kind of big box of settings, it's got a little tab here so you can jump to it. And importantly, you can select all or select just scores or select just parts down here. So let's look at parts, right? So just quickly, I'll pick a size. 7mm is good. A4 is a good size. Page. Then I want to go down to flows, right? Now, I always want, in most editions of music parts from kind of classical era, new movements are allowed to start on the same page as the end of an old movement. And I'm happy for that, right? But say I wanted to kill a few trees, I could always click that. The first page template, that's an engraving mode thing, right? So you can use page templates to make your first page look different to all the rest, and you just decide whether you want that to be only on the first flow or on all the flows that start at the top of the page. This is probably the one that I really want to point out though. Show flow headings, right? This will be turned on if you turned it on in the Steinberg Hub, the very first screen you saw. But we didn't use that. We just opened an empty project. So I'm going to say for all flows, I want to see the heading. So I want to see the name of the movement in front of every movement, right? And I will go to full score because I want that to be true on the full score as well. Just apply the changes before I move. Full score for all flows, apply, and go back to my parts. Okay, you can also say things like, do you want the flow title to be in the header? Yes, I do. Do I want the page number in the header above flow headings? No. You can change all those things as you like, right? I'm just trying to think, is there anything else that I really want to do in here that's important? There are some player things, right? Actually, I might talk about one of these things. Where is it? It's down the bottom. Of course it is. Okay, there's condensing, right? Now here is where you set options for condensing. You can turn it on and off in, I believe it's the edit tab, anywhere, but for now, I'm going to turn it on, right? And I'm going to show you what it does. If I just scroll over for a second, you can see that I have my score here. If I hit apply with enable condensing turned on, right, what's going to happen, oh, that's my bad, it's because I did that to the part. Let me do that to the score. Turn enable condensing on and hit apply. My flute 1 and 2s are going to combine onto the same stuff, right? Now how does that actually work, right? Let me go to write mode and put some music in. Just ignore me for a minute. I'm going to put some music in. I'm going to make some stuff up. We're in C major and 2/4. And we're going to put in just a nice little something like this. Let's actually make that into that, right? And then I'm going to copy it, move it down a third into flute 2. But I'm actually going to change some things. I'm going to do this. Just making up some stuff. Don't mind me for a minute. Change this to be that's not what I want at all. I'm going to do that. Right, okay. I'm going to go back to page view, right? So you can see this is what's happened, right? It has condensed these things, the flute 1 and 2 parts, to be on the same staff, right? And it's done this reasonably intelligently, right? So it's kind of looked at groups and decided whether to have split stems or not, right? So it's decided here not to share the same stem because we've got some different rhythms and things like that here, right? If I change a few things, like this, and go back now, sorry, I'm making this up as I go along. I might say this for another video when I've had more time to plan. But essentially we can change some things about the way condensing happens so that it shares stems, and it will intelligently decide most of those things for you based on the music. But if I just get my layout options back up before, this is the bit that I wanted to talk about quickly, which is how you can turn that off for certain things. So importantly, things like section players. So like we're happy for, if the violins are in divisi, for the divisi to condense back onto a single stave, but we don't want adjacent players. So we don't want violin 1 and violin 2 to be mushed together. You can have this on and exclude violins specifically because of violin 1, violin 2, exactly that. But generally, that's what we want, just divisi. In here are also the rules about what labels are on the staves. Do they use the full name or the abbreviated name? Some quick and easy things to start engraving a little bit quickly, such as casting off. So if you're doing popular music, you might want 4 or 8 bars per system by default, right? Or a fixed number of frames. What else? Time signatures, whether you want standard ones, whether you want one per family, and some different designs, and then vertical spacing. So in here is your minimum gaps between staffs, or between a staff group to a staff, or between staff groups, or between systems, and all these sorts of rules for avoiding collisions vertically, as well as hiding empty staves after the first page, after the first system rather, or on all systems or never, right? Or forcing that on. So layout options where you change the way your page layout looks, right? If I close that, notation options involves the way the music actually looks. So things about, these are the things that I would consider writing music in terms of how, like, where do accidentals go? Like, do you need to cancel that accidental? Maybe some things like cautionary accidentals. Do you want cautionaries when they're separated by an octave? Yes, but in parentheses, or no. Do you want cautionaries in the next bar at different octaves? All those kinds of things. What do you do with clefs? Do you want the 8VA indicator on them? Do you want cautionary time signatures, key signatures, all those kinds of things, right? What do you do with bar lines? What's the default bar line? What do you want at the end? All those kinds of things, they're in here, and they are on a per flow basis, right? I personally find this more annoying than helpful. I could see why it would be helpful in terms of you might need some option set specifically for some maybe quite modern or some atonal movement in the middle of a more tonal piece or something like that. But I usually just go select all, select all, and then change some options, and then hit apply. My suggestion is work out what you like, save as a default, and then use that from then on. Okay. Then we go to the next set of options, which is note input options. This is all about how you actually input notes. I'm just trying to think. I don't think I've ever changed anything in here from the defaults. Particularly though, I suspect if you're going to want to change things, it's going to be MIDI input, which is some of the, if you're using a MIDI keyboard to input notes. I personally don't do that very often, so that's why I haven't changed any options, but there's some options here about how that works. And then possibly Paste Special might have some things. Anyway, maybe worth going through and working it out. But the last one is playback options, right? And here it has things like what kind of dynamic curve do you want, right? So do you want it to be pretty much linear, soft to loud, right? Or do you want there to be a really emphasized moderate region, right, etc.? Do you want humanization factors on? When you have a polyphonic instrument like a piano, do you want things like single notes or repeated notes to be played out louder or softer and things like that? If it's contrapuntal music, there's some rules that can be used. How loud do you want accents? First beat of the bar, a little bit louder or not? Accents versus marcatos versus tenutos, staccatos, all those kinds of things. How long do you want a staccato note to go for, etc. But also things like, should repeats be replayed after Darsenyo and Darkotas, glissandos, all those kinds of things. They're all in here, right? Now, my suggestion is that you remember shortcuts where possible. To get a settings shortcut, the shortcut is Command Shift and then the first letter of whatever type of settings it is. So if you want engraving, Command Shift E. If you want playback, Command Shift P. If you want layout, Command Shift L. If you want input options, Command Shift I. And if you want notation options, Command Shift N. Right. Okay, I think that is pretty much everything that you could do kind of to set up your score, right? From here on out, we would go into writing. There's one other thing I want to mention before I go, and that's this library manager I talked about briefly, right? So you've set up all your options, how you like things, right? You might save some of them as defaults, you might not. Either way, though, you go, there is a score that I did a couple of months ago that I really, really liked, and I want to borrow some options there. How do you do that? Well, you could copy and paste that file, make a duplicate essentially, open it up, delete the music and work from there. But the far better option is to go to the library manager, right? So the library manager has all of the options that Dorico has, all the different types of options and all the different things, lines and all that kind of stuff that Dorico has. And you can compare them to the factory settings. So you can see that there are lots that I have that are not in line with the factory settings in this score. That's because I've changed some things. That's my default. If I go to user library, right, there are probably more things that are in line. But this here is the useful one, Dorico project, right? So if I go to here, you can drop a project file in there or click there, and I go and find a Dorico project that I really like, right? As an example, I'm just going to go and find the chamber ones, right? Nope, I lie. I'm going to go to, if you just excuse me for a second, one that I know I've done not too bad. This one, right? Work of mine. Okay, so I've import this file I'm really proud of. And you can see there's lots that's different, right? Everything that's red, not equal sign, means that lots is different. If I want to, everything with the blue tick says all options match. I'm just going to show the differences though, right? So these are all the differences in these engraving options, right? So as an example, bar lines. I've got my bar line thickness in this project that I imported set to 11/50ths of a space, not 1/5 of a space, which is what it currently is. So I can just click this not equals, turns into an arrow, and click it, and it has now moved that setting across. Right? I could do that for a whole group. So I could say I really like the bar lines and just copy those settings across. Now they've all been copied. Or I love all engraving options, so copy them all. Right? I'm going to copy all of these collections of lines and things. So if you make any custom things, that's a good thing to do. You can go to layout options and pick exactly on a per layout basis what you like. So for the full score layout, I really like the full score. So I'm going to copy all of these things in the full score. But I'm going to compare flute parts, and I'm going to copy all of these things as well, except I really, really don't like the vertical spacing. I prefer the vertical spacing I've got, so I'm going to turn that off, right, and not copy the vertical spacing. Similarly, notation options, and again, these are on a per flow basis. You can copy things, or you can copy the whole group together. No input options. Oh, I do have one setting changed. I lie. And then playback options, right? I've got some of these chosen, like the humanization things or the dynamics. I want all of them, so I'm going to hit that. So you can see everything has been copied over except for some layout options. And I hit apply or close and apply. And it's done. And you can see that things have changed a bit. Right. So it's a great way to import some settings you've saved. And you can see there's an export library button to go the other way. But you can just use a regular Dorico file, so you don't have to do that. But that's changed all these settings quickly and easily in one fell swoop, which is really useful. I think that is everything that I want to talk about setup mode wise. That should be enough to get a score open and started and ready to start writing some music. So I'll leave that there, and I shall see you in the next one. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll try my best to answer, and then I'll try and move on to write mode. Ciao.